Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth seminar in our Support Hub Data and Evaluation series. I'm Ryan Souza. I'm the Program Director for the CSAC Support Hub for Criminal Justice Programming. We're rounding the final turn on this seminar series, and we have some pretty important and great things to discuss today, so we're glad you made it. Okay, these seminar series are brought to you by the CSAC Support Hub for Criminal Justice Programming. Our entire foundation for help with counties is really in the support hub is what we call the strategic framework. This umbrella that you see before you today is designed to cover really designing, implementing, and improving evidence-based and data-driven programming operations from beginning to end. Right now, our grant really focuses on building capacity at the county level, and that's led by technical assistance provided by our CSAC consultants, so you see on the screen before you today. And they'll help guide you through individual components or complex pieces of these framework pieces and really just kind of help sort out some of the more complex questions that exist. This framework really in totality sets your county up to defend the work that it's doing by building and designing evidence-based programming, or in the alternative to that, recognizing what may be innovative or theory-based and still really setting a plan of action to measure what you're doing or trying to achieve and how you're going to prove it. Although each of these components we've discussed in detail before, I just want to really talk about kind of the process here. So counties are undertaking efforts are in completely different places in these components. Don't let that deter you from jumping in and starting to talk to us about where you want to be and what you're doing. The good thing about all of this work is it can really meet counties where they're at and what they need. The framework goes, as I said, from really designing and understanding your programming interventions to creating really critical cross-agency lists, formally setting a path for documentation expectations and outcomes, and then actual implementation of those programs through contracting. One of the most important functions, and really what we designed an entire seminar series around, which is where you're here today, is really addressing meaningful data strategies to help understanding what's happening, to get data from other sources and ultimately create dashboards that are meaningful to the counties, both in their operational efforts and to really be transparent. All of this with the end goal, which you see in the last component there, really focusing on outcome evaluations and the ability to perform cost benefit analysis, both nationally and locally. The culmination of this is really everything you've done previously and everything kind of where you strive to be in operations in the county. In the world of programming, nothing is really better than being able to show the hard work administrative and operational teams are doing every day. And so this, even in the alternative about what doesn't work, really helps you be educated in the structure of how to approach programming and how to ultimately control the narrative of what you're doing locally. And so this framework is just really exciting. I love the work that we're doing, and I'm so happy that you guys are all here today. And we're really just going to jump in. So I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to Mia Bird, who's going to take us through the first portion of this and really start discussing some data dashboard stuff. Mia?
Thank you, Ryan. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all here today. We are moving from the really tough building part of the seminar, those first 3 sessions where we were focused on how do you build your data infrastructure. And I'm so happy that all of you hung in through that, because now we're getting to the phase where we get to talk about, well, how you use it. And so in the first and second seminar, we talked about kind of accessing county and state data and preparing it for integration. In the third session, we talked about how we go about integrating it and some use cases for integration. And during that session, Denise brought up the great idea of scoping out some different scenarios. So we had a couple we talked about during that session, but there are several more that might be useful. And so I just wanted to respond to that before we dive in today by saying that we're going to actually do that in the final seminar meeting, in the outcomes evaluation meeting. So what we'll do, you'll have a handout or a material that outlines a set of common scenarios where you would want to either access county data or linked county and state data, sort of how you would go about the process of doing that, given the key questions you have in mind. And then what you might be able to draw from descriptively looking at the data, which is what we're going to talk about today. You know, how can you visualize your data? What can you draw from that in terms of insights? And then finally, if you wanted to draw some causal conclusions, such as an outcomes evaluation, what would be the methodology for going about doing that? So Denise, stay tuned, and any of you who thought that that would be helpful, because we'll have that in the final seminar. Today, we're really going to focus on that first stage, which is you've got the data, you've got this complex, rich data set that only maybe a few people within your agency or within your county have the software access and the background to do analytics using that data. But so many more people can access insights from that data if we're able to find ways to visualize the data. So if we're able to remove that barrier to accessing the data, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And data dashboards are a really great way to do that. So we're largely focused on data dashboards. And then in our last seminar, we're going to come to outcomes evaluation, and our main focus is going to be on policies and programs. So we know that in the criminal justice space, there's tons of causal drivers, some of which we understand, some of which we may not understand. But we know that among those, there are a few that we actually have control over. There are a few that we can do something about. And so that's really what we're focused on in the last seminar. What are the policies and programs that you within the county can change or alter in order to have the impact you're trying to achieve? And how can we use the data that you've built, this amazing data infrastructure, in order to learn about how what you're doing can have the greatest impact, or the impact that you want to achieve? So that's what we'll be doing for the rest of our time together. Our session today is really focused on a lot of content on sort of how you build a data dashboard, right? We're going to do a lot of sort of the logistics of that. But before we jump into that, I'm going to take a few minutes just to talk about, what are data dashboards? If some of you haven't encountered them before, we can talk about that a bit. And most of you probably have encountered them before. And there's sort of a whole range of what they might look like. So we're going to talk a little bit about what they are, and then just an overview of how they can be useful. Why would we do this? What can we get out of data dashboards? And then Kevin is going to take over and walk you through the process of designing a data dashboard. So thinking about, what are your goals? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Really being intentional about the design of the dashboard. And then what's the process that you go through to get there? What's a good process outline to move your agency or your county to that end result? And then he's got some really great tips on building effective data visualization. So really putting some thought into what to do and what not to do to make the meaning come through, the meaning encased in your data, to make that come through or reveal it through the data visualizations. And then finally, we're going to show you examples from probation and from jails of data dashboards that are really effective and helpful. So what are data dashboards? I'm going to give you a really simple, high-level definition here as a data dashboard that is just a related set of data visualizations. And when we say data visualizations, we mean something that we might call a chart or a figure or a graph, some way of presenting data so that when you visualize it, when you look at that figure or chart, you can draw information from that. You can draw insights from that, rather than having to work with the underlying data to understand what the data is saying. And so visualizations, they really expand access to the information, and they create sort of a platform where we can have discussions as a broad group, right? All stakeholders can participate, and the visualization can create a common understanding of what's going on. So they're really valuable in that way, especially as counties or agencies are trying to move forward in making changes toward the goals they're trying to realize. And so we love data visualizations. They can be good visualizations, or they can be confusing visualizations that are either not informative, or we're not able to draw anything from by looking at them visually. And so Kevin's going to dig into that a bit. They can be of high or low quality. So we're aiming for high quality visualizations where you can just look at them and you can really learn a lot about what's happening, about the question that you have. So when we think about a dashboard, we use visualizations all the time in reporting and presentations, but when we think about a dashboard, what we mean is bringing a lot of different visualizations together so that we have sort of a relationship between them. And so that we create the ability to tell a story or to provide a set of information to draw more complex conclusions about what might be going on. And so we can do that in a couple of different ways. We can have a static dashboard, and a static dashboard is often because we often have a static dashboard because we have data that are at a summary level, right? And so we have data that can't really be manipulated to a large degree. And so we might create visualizations with the idea of telling one particular story. And often that's using summary level data. So a static dashboard is a dashboard you can't play with, right? You can't mess with. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. A dynamic dashboard may have some questions and should have some questions or goals that are driving the visualizations that you choose and how you relate them to each other, but it's much more open. A dynamic dashboard lets the user get in there and ask their own questions by visually navigating through the dashboard and really exploring it, or what I call, playing with it, getting into the dashboard. And I'm going to show you an example of that as well. So I'm just going to stop my share for a second and take you to some dashboards. Okay. So you all may be familiar with this dashboard. This is a CPOC dashboard, and it's showing us the distribution of, well, it's thinking. It's going to show us the distribution of the adult supervised and juvenile supervised population from 2018, the breakdown of that population. And this is extremely valuable information to have about the probation populations, but it's coming from that summary level data. So we can't really interact what we're seeing here with any other information, such as, for example, demographics. We might want to know, well, what are the demographics of the felony population versus misdemeanor versus PRCS, just as one example. And so it's building on summary level data. And so it's really valuable to put this data together in a dashboard, and I'll show you there's a bit more here. But it's also limited in the sense that because the data underlying it is summary level, it's really giving us sort of a fixed view of this population. There's nothing we can do to explore the data. Now, these dashboards are based on mock data, so I'll just alleviate anyone's concerns that we're looking at real data from any county. This is fake data, but it's meant to give you an idea of what a dynamic dashboard would look like and how you might play around with it. And so let me just walk you through what we have going on here. So let's just focus at the top of the dashboard. We're looking at some jail bookings data for 2018. And we can see that these are bookings by month, and we can see by type. And there's a legend right here that tells us what type. And then we can see the breakdown by, for example, property offenses. And if you select property offenses, you just get the property offense booking line. But what you also get is a change in the rebooking rate. So this rebooking rate just applies to those individuals who were booked on property offenses. And then if you were to, again, make a new selection of felony, then this rebooking rate again changes just for that population. And so what we're doing here is we're exploring the data. And here's a similar example for probation dashboards. And so in this example, you can see one of the components I've added here is program participation, right? And so the rebooking rate broken down by having participated in programming or not. And you can see the distribution of that. And then if you, again, select down, you can see that everything changes, including the rebooking rates, as well as the distribution of offenses over here. Okay, so that's a little overview of sort of those different kinds of dashboards. I'm going to take you back to the slides. So why are they useful? You've probably already made some inferences about that in your own work or just from exploring the dashboards over the last couple minutes. But generally speaking, data dashboards in the criminal justice space, they're going to track those key characteristics. So whether they're demographic or they're criminal history characteristics, they can track interventions such as those programming interventions, but also things like flash incarcerations or revocations. And they also can track outcomes, and we can decide what we want those outcomes to be. But in this case, it was rebooking that we had as the main outcome. And that was because we were focusing mainly on local data. If you were to bring in other data, you might be able to track returns to prison or things that come from state data like out-of-state rearrest and reconvictions. and to show a descriptive relationship between those variables. And you probably saw that you could see there was a relationship between the category of offense, the charge level of that offense, and the rebooking rate. And so what we're starting to do by exploring these descriptive data dashboards is we're starting to create hypotheses about what relationships might exist. And these hypotheses can be so important in thinking about, well, then where should we be doing further analyses, right? Where should we be doing some causal analyses to explore those things? Importantly, as I mentioned, data dashboards should really expand access to broad audiences, both internal to the agency, external within the county partners for that agency, and even to stakeholders outside of the criminal justice agency space. So they're really important tools to be able to communicate, to be able to kind of democratize the ability to explore and investigate the data, and then really to provide this basis for a shared, transparent understanding of what the descriptives are for the criminal justice population and have that basis for any further decision making. So I'm going to give you just one example. A programmatic intervention, and you saw in the probation dashboard, we had a set of the main programs for this mock county, this fake county. And what we could do just by having that is to start to understand the demographic reach and targeting of the programs, or the criminal justice reach, who is getting this program, who is not. And are there some gaps? Are we seeing some gaps for subpopulations, whether it be demographic or based on their criminal characteristics? Are there programmatic gaps? And that can really help to inform how you allocate resources towards programs, what you might want to expand, or where you might want to look for new kinds of programs to fill those gaps. And then we can also compare descriptively those outcomes of those who are receiving or are not receiving the programming, and then identify, where we really want to focus. Often we don't have infinite resources to do outcomes evaluations. So where do you want to focus your resources for outcomes evaluation? So I'm coming back to the main group. I think Ryan's going to launch a poll for us, and then we're going to shift over to Kevin walking us through some of these design decisions.
Thank you, Mia. We have 2 poll questions up. I think they're up. And so feel free to answer them. It's basically, what have you experienced in terms of data dashboards? And then also which ones have you seen essentially? Excel, Power BI, Tableau. Just like to get an idea of this as we move forward so we can kind of tailor questions and maybe even some of the conversation about what you may like or what you struggled with these dashboards that you've encountered before. We're going to give it just another couple of seconds and we'll still have some responses coming in. Good news is a lot of you have viewed dashboards, so that's a solid place to start here. You at least have seen them before and have an idea. We're going to go ahead and end the polling now and just share it so you can kind of see what people are doing. So it looks like a lot of you have experience in dashboards. It's a great thing. It's a great conversation. And some of that I think could also be useful today if you have questions or just general comments about some of the struggles you've had with dashboards. And then also it looks like you've been pretty far across the board in terms of what has been available to you: Excel, Power BI, and Tableau. And so I think we could just want to stop for a second. Thank you for this info, and then see if we have any immediate questions or comments about what we've discussed so far, and then I'll move it over to Kevin after that. I don't see any hands raised, but if you're on the phone, you can hit *9, if I remember correctly, to raise or lower your hand, or you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question or give us a comment if you have one.
Yeah, we know it's really early in the seminar to be asking questions, but we're really curious before we launch into the design process, if any of you have had experience with trying to build a data dashboard in particular. I see Karen's hand up.
I had a question or a comment as well that I'm hoping you guys will touch on today. We've attempted to build some dashboards. We've viewed dashboards. I think one of the challenges that we have locally that I'm hoping you guys can provide some insight is, as different audiences consume that information, what seems clear to me or our department is misinterpreted by others. And so adding in some like definitions of what we mean by some of this information has been a real challenge to make that consumable and accessible and understandable to the public and to our different stakeholders. And so just some insight on how best to include that in a dashboard, because there's, you know, real estate is, there's not a lot. And so like, how do we sort of help educate those that are consuming it?
I think that's really the crux of I think a lot of this, because I think there's kind of this thing that just because the software allows you to do certain things and put data into these really pretty charts, it suddenly assumes that everyone's going to understand what you're talking about. And so actually, I think just defining your audience is a big deal, as well as kind of really defining terms. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So I actually have a pretty good example from one of our counties as well that's actually, I think, done a really good job of kind of taking that audience into consideration. So that almost is like the point of the next probably hour or so, to make sure you can identify an audience and also use that data effectively to reach that audience in a way that's actually going to make sense to them, not just to you as the person who owns the data. But that's exactly one of the biggest challenges with dashboards, I think, is you can do it, just doesn't mean it's actually going to be effective at doing what you want it to do.
And I think just adding to that, as much as we try to sort of define our audience, it just takes on a life of its own once it's sort of published. And so it goes out and then, so help.
Yeah, I think that'll be, let's definitely touch on that in the discussion section. I think that's what also, like, people have the enthusiasm to build these dashboards, but I think oftentimes it gets kind of squelched by negative impacts or things that you're not really seeing improvements in how people see you. You're not seeing yourselves as transparent. So you still feel like people want more, and it's almost like it opens up the floodgates. But I think if you kind of start with some values of what you're trying to do with it and start incrementally, I think it can go a long way. But I think that's definitely, I think, the challenge, I think, of dashboards. It's great, a lot of promise, but I think still a lot left to do about what you actually can do with them, both in the government sphere, I think, as well as the private sector who have done this for a little bit longer. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about what's the strategy, not just of the data, but also like why are you doing it in the first place? What's the point? I think that really helps to define what you might want to do with it. So let me jump in, and we'll definitely come back to some of those topics, because those are the heart of it.
Can I add one thing, Kevin? And I'm also curious, you know, I think we have a few minutes today. We can chat if other folks are having, I'm curious if other folks have had this challenge with dashboards they've tried to build, sort of a confusion among the audience on how terms are defined or how trends are interpreted. A couple of things you can do, and Karen, you may have done this, is to build in additional pages that are like a code book for the data, so that define the terms. And something you can also do is to have an accompanying fact sheet or report that's released. It's something you can even have on the same page where the dashboard link is available. You can have a report that goes along with the dashboard that summarizes the key trends or insights sort of on a regular basis. So either annually or on whatever basis you want, that from the perspective of the department summarizes the key takeaways. And that can even be helpful for an even broader audience that isn't even comfortable playing with the data, but still wants to know sort of the key information that's being represented in the dashboard. So is anyone else having this challenge or a challenge like this? I see Karen's hand up.
Sorry, I'm slow at Zoom. What I was going to say is at Alameda County, we do have a public-facing set of dashboards around our population that are somewhat manipulative. We always include a data dictionary is what we refer to it as, but to hopefully answer some of those basic questions. I actually had another question, Tableau versus Power BI. We really struggled with which way to go with that here, and for a number of reasons related to our case management system, we went with Power BI. But what I've discovered is you pretty much need a PhD in software in order to do it. And so we're paying a consultant an exorbitant amount of money to design our Power BI reports. And I was just curious if anybody else has had that experience. And where are all these people? You go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And I think, and actually that was a lot of these, because there are kind of two dominant ones, like kind of these software packages, and that is a big consideration, but there are a lot of other ones as well. And so I think they're all going to have the same issue, because a lot of times the challenge is not the software itself, it's like what you're actually trying to say. So it's almost like the coding and the data behind it. So it almost oftentimes adds a lot of complexity to it. The visuals themselves, like a pie chart is a pie chart, a line graph's a line graph, but I agree, it really does take somebody who understands the operational piece as well as the software which becomes really hard to find unless you have somebody who's really is their job to go out and engage audiences and design these things. I don't think they're that different. I think Power BI is a little bit less expensive. It's more integrated into other Microsoft things if you have it. But I think Tableau has a little bit more of a, is moving a little faster in some areas. So I think there might be some, some areas there. But I think who can you actually train in your department to run it and actually do the work, I think is a huge consideration. I don't think either of them are known to be any easier than the other, which is the bad news. So I think that's kind of the trade-off, is neither of them are probably easier than the other. They're all going to take someone with a fair amount of experience and expertise in both the design part as well as the operational piece and the data like merging and kind of like putting together.
Yeah, and I think that's true. But Karen, I would encourage you to leverage us. I do think you need a dedicated, well, you could have a consultant, but ideally you would have dedicated staff that know how to use this software. But I do feel like it's very possible to be trained with the right kind of guidance. And so, our team is here both to help build dashboards and help maintain them, but to also help to train staff to do that. You just need someone who's, I think, willing to take that on. So please, use us in that way if we can be helpful. And I see Boo is sharing that Santa Clara has data stories with data visualizations. Boo, do you want to say anything more about that? It's sort of like having a summary report to go with the dashboard. Is that right?
We, a couple of years ago, we acquired a vendor. It used to be Socrata, now it's Tyler Technology. And you don't need any technical. If I can do it, anybody can do it. And what it is it has templates and also data visualization that you can embed in there. There's templates to build dashboards. What I really like about it is that you can control your message and give context to the public in terms of what they're looking at. And so in the past couple of years, we've been working to increase our data asset, not only in public safety, but across our county services. So I'll put our link there, but I believe that Alameda and others also have an open data platform, and different counties are choosing to share different things. And I think the most common is the COVID information right now. So it just gives you a great example of how you could share information and create stories.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think the open data part's a good, because that's the open data part means actually that anybody has access to it and then can make their own stories out of it. So that's both more permissive, but you also get more input and more ideas being generated. So there's all these kind of trade-offs between you creating it as the government or the county entity versus having somebody else who's outside it. So I think that really does speak to like freeing the data. You don't know what you're going to get from it, and a lot of times it's good stuff because you actually find out new insights that you just don't have the time to dig for or display. So I think open data is another part of like where you actually get the data from. And I think actually Alvaro has a good comment here about self-training. I think a lot of this stuff is self-trainable. And I think, and it's kind of piggyback what Mia was saying, but I think there is like some things you can train or a process you can go through. I think what people get confused by is like, they just want volume instead of quality. And so I think starting with quality and saying, what are the 4 or 5 things I really want to know and display, just can be incremental, because it is like any big software project. You're trying to create a product that people can see and use, not just do one time. And so I think as long as you have a process in place that actually has people reviewing it and looking about it and caring about it, you can kind of build it through. And I think that's, kind of going through some steps, but access to data is a huge first step though. But I would say it's a trainable skill.
Okay.
Anything else?
Mia, anything else?
No, I was just going to note there's a comment from Lisa also that it's been an iterative process of trying to learn after publishing what people don't understand and then add clarity. And the truth is sometimes things are going to always be misinterpreted. And it is part of the process to deal with that. And so it is one of the challenges of making your data more available. But there are also pros to those cons. So thank you, Lisa, for that comment.
So I'm going to walk through I guess the intention here is to kind of walk through a process, because a lot of what I've kind of found works is actually a very repeatable process, or we're kind of like workshopping it. Because a lot of times what we're doing is we're starting with the visual that we as the analyst or as the person who thinks this is important is starting with, instead of really thinking about what are we trying to say, what are the key questions, simplifying it to the point where it actually could be one message or one question. And I think there is this kind of need to kind of load up as much information as possible because the data is there. Let's do something with it. But we just know people have scattered attention spans and aren't always paying attention. They may have other agendas. And I think part of this is it is an iterative process. And the beauty of I think a lot of these software now is you can do it like almost like a version A, version B, version C, and keep learning and keep representing it, but kind of take incremental steps. There is kind of a design build process we can kind of go through. So I'm going to walk through a couple of just kind of slides and ideas here, and they're really kind of meant to be a kind of a framework to have you guys take a look at and think about. And I think for me, it kind of starts with like, why are we even doing this? I think there's been this push recently to say data must be everywhere. COVID has definitely kind of expanded the reach, the interest, the love of kind of instant, where is my data kind of interest. And as we kind of saw in lots of states with COVID, we didn't really understand what was happening. The testing was wrong. The data was slow. It wasn't really matching up on a time and a place. And I think a lot of times we're kind of learning those, like, what are we really trying to learn from this? And what's the basic message and what's the takeaway? And so I think for me, it's kind of starting with like, what are you really trying to do with this? And I think with kind of, if you can kind of start with a couple of different values or ideas, it helps to guide what you're trying to do and doesn't feel like you're trying to take everything on, explain everything, or every single data point gets a dashboard, because it's not all of equal value. So I think as you're kind of thinking about this, like, what is the one thing you want someone to take away who's got limited attention? That's really important. And, I think about if it's their job to build dashboards, all they're going to do is pump out dashboards, not say, wait a second, what does this really mean? How do I really think about the implications for this? And what's actually going to happen from it? And I think that the wonderful use cases we all dream of are, we're able to measure our government services, as Mia was pointing out in some of her dashboards. Great, let's do that. We're actually able to identify, things that need a better assistance and better services. We can see gaps, we can see geographic issues, we can see disparities, we can see all these like revelations through data we're all kind of hoping are going to happen. We kind of know it's still just about kind of looking at these charts and making sure it all looks the way it's supposed to look. But really, it's starting with those values. What are we really trying to do with it? And I think our hope is to really kind of like stimulate new ideas and get new insights from things. And, as Mia was saying, the exploration part is really the value here. If I say the number is 10, you want to look more, you want to look deeper, you want to look differently. And that kind of democratizes it across agencies and also across kind of the community as well. So really the goal here is to say, what are we trying to do this? And really, do we want these different parts, and what are our goals for doing it when you're building out either a dashboard team or a project team? So I think I've seen this done two ways, either as a project, like this is not somebody's job, it's multiple people's jobs, versus having it be, a program that is happening forever and ever. So it's kind of important to think about like, what are we trying to do and who is that team that's going to be doing this? And so what's kind of a process? What can this look like? We have some materials on in the folder as well to kind of walk you through some of these ideas, but I think really it's about identifying key questions and really kind of be able to put that in words, like what you're actually trying to do with it. If you can't really articulate it as a question or as a key point, it probably means the dashboard isn't really going to hang together as a single set of visualizations. Because at some point there's a maximum number of things you can put on a slide before it gets way too busy, too many colors, too many graphs, too many pie charts, whatever it is. So the idea is to really make sure you can identify the key questions, and those can come from various places, but make sure you identify what those key issues are. What are the data fields needed? Because this gets to, the possibilities is if you don't actually have access to some of these data points, you can't do it. Or if it's actually too hard to code it, you kind of run into the problem I think that Karen might be getting at too, which is you can build the dashboard, but God, that data is really hard to get at. We need somebody who really knows a lot of like coding to actually do that, which is different than building a chart, building a visualization. So actually need to know what the ingredients are to build it, actually build the data infrastructure to then transfer it seamlessly and make sure it can get to where you want to go. Actually be able to import the files and start creating a visualization from it, because all this starts with the data available, but you have to kind of know how to get it and what that format's going to be. Then lastly, really define and understand your audience and how you're going to get it to them. The digital format is great, but those have trade-offs. So make sure you're kind of going through a set of processes to really kind of map these things out. So I'm going to give a couple examples here of kind of what that could look like. And these are pretty general, but identify some key questions like what you're really trying to see. And so there's some basic questions that maybe a probation office might be interested in. Like, what's the flow of people onto supervision? What kind of reasons do probationers have for receiving violations of probation? What are the kind of censoring reports being written? What's the profile of youth in juvenile hall? Like, all these are all very basic questions, but you can actually do it a lot of different ways and get into a lot of different themes. So once you kind of get there and you say, I'd really like to know more about the flow of people onto supervision. We don't have a good handle on who's coming on to supervision, where they are. what do we want to know? We want to know the case types, maybe the gender, race and ethnicity, the age, where they're from. So really basic questions. It may seem like, okay, it sounds great, but a lot of times I think agencies struggle with some of the basic questions, because when you ask somebody who's on supervision or who's on probation, it says, well, what kind of supervision? What do you mean? And on my caseload, I have 100 people. That's who I think is on supervision, not the 1,000 other people from a different one. So really it helps to make sure everybody's talking about the same group and has a really clear definition of what this looks like across time and across agency. So you're not actually all giving slightly different answers to the same question. Then actually figure out what the data fields are. So this gets to some of Mia's first seminars about, like, where do you get all this county level data? I mean, this isn't hard to get information, but if you can't get it, you kind of know where to get it before you can actually go with it. So for that example above with actually who would be on supervision, maybe at the person level, you want to know the gender, the date of birth, race and ethnicity, the last known zip code. But then you also want to know information about the actual case itself. So what kind of supervision was it? Maybe the start date of supervision, maybe the end date of the probation grant, the basic things that are really about the person to kind of make sure you can kind of get a little more detail, and then about the case itself. But those end up being kind of some basic ingredients to say, with this kind of information over time, or, at some point in time, we actually can build a dashboard that's, probably pretty compelling and probably pretty unique in the community, because most folks don't have a great handle just on the basic facts sometimes. And then how does this look? Then kind of building out the infrastructure, really creating the summary files. So, obviously someone's got to develop a query of all the relevant fields. If you've ever looked under the hood of your case management systems, your risk assessment tools, these are oftentimes 50, 60, 100 different tables. So really it's no small feat sometimes to create a query of all those relevant fields. But once you have it, you can save it and it's done. You can bank it. And then you're going to have somebody like maybe a case management system developer, like somehow securely send the files, then have the dashboard developer actually start creating it. So you're kind of looking at this, like the creation of the dashboard kind of comes later in the process. I think too often we kind of start with, let's just start building something and not kind of how it all comes together. But planning this out can give you a better idea of what this is going to look like. And so what do? Really, you're trying to do like, what data is most important to show when you're creating the visualizations. Like, what are the things you want someone to focus on? What are the areas that are important, different, unique about the data you have? That's really what makes data visualization compelling. And kind of back to the COVID example, it was so important to people. It was so unique that, we could actually bring this to bear that people wanted to see it and really compelled by it. So what is actually the most important thing you want people to know? And what are the kind of things you want to emphasize? There's all these different tools now in data visualization, from colors and different types of charts and all these different ways to bring this out. What are the things you want to emphasize? And make sure you're doing it consciously. Because I think if you emphasize everything, then nothing's important. And so I think when I say emphasize, it's like, what's the thing you want? What's the one thing you want someone to understand from this data, or get the message you want to get from it? And how do you make sure they see that really clearly? Then kind of gets like, what are the kind of options you have for displaying this data? And, usually it's things like colors, types of charts, but there's a lot of visual cues you can give to actually make a pretty compelling visualization and still keep it fairly simple. And then lastly, like, what's the most effective way to communicate the data? I think the visualizations that we've kind of been talking about are ones that are interactive. You can actually drill down and click different things and drill down to a fairly specific layer. But oftentimes, actually, it's better to have that aggregate level of information as well, if it's maybe a public audience or someone who's not as familiar with the information. So really kind of make sure it's what's going to be the most effective at reaching the audience you want to reach. And again, it's not because you have all this data and have all this information, doesn't mean you have to put it out there in that most detailed way. And maybe sometimes you shouldn't. So it's also a way to make sure what's going to be the most effective at reaching that audience that meets kind of all the different demands of your groups. And lastly, like, how do you then actually publish the right kind of audience? And the way that I think about these is they usually kind of happen in an internal agency. I know we have some folks here working like maybe centralized, like county administrator offices or other ones that are kind of overseeing lots of different agencies. But most of it is going to start in an agency somewhere who's closest to the data. And really, what an internal agency would probably get is all the different views. Everything they want to create, they would have access to, because you're publishing it to your own agency. It all probably live on an internal server and some kind of internal mechanism. So really, it's not being shared beyond the agency, most likely, of all the richness and all the depth. But also, usually the agency will have most of the access to any kind of data they want, down to some kind of basic probably parameters. But usually, they'll have quite a bit of access to their own data. But also, it's based on the roles within the agency. And this can be done to simplify. You don't want, maybe you don't want people to see everything because it's a little too much, or because you also want to make sure some of it is specialized to certain levels of management or to certain types of officers. But the point is you have a lot of control, and maybe this is where you have the most detail, but it's knowing that audience can be that most detailed. Maybe the next level up from that is maybe kind of a county level intranet or some kind of county share. And this gets to things that maybe some of the views you want to share about your agency's work is still an internal server. They might have access to some of the underlying data, maybe not all of it, but also it's based on kind of some shared clients or shared statuses. Because at the end of the day, there's how many different agencies in a county. You don't all care about each other's work like the same. You kind of care about your own agency's work the most because that's who you know the best. So sometimes it's actually better to kind of have a higher level understanding of each agency and not like you have to understand everything. But the idea here is to at least share some basics so you can have that collaborative view. And lastly, a public website. And this is, I think, what Karen was getting at. When you actually start using dashboards to push things out there, you need to be really careful what you're putting out there because the public, I think even the most informed public may not have the same understanding of the data as you do. They're not going to probably get the same number of views or the types of views. And also this will be public facing. So this becomes something where you have to really think about more of a communication strategy for all the diverse audiences who might be coming across this, both things you'd want to see and the good things you want to get, like some good PR, some good press, a better understanding of your work, or the negative things that might come from people exploring and seeing differences in your data you weren't prepared for. But the point is, and I think we kind of said this a few times, is make sure it has context and actually make sure it's also at the right level of summary so people aren't getting the detailed data they shouldn't be getting access to, but also has context and kind of some summaries and basic things. So really the idea here is to kind of start from the process of answering good questions and then kind of end up with some kind of the considerations for where you want to put it. And so some key audience considerations, and this gets to what Karen was saying, educate the audience around terminology. I guarantee you that people know more about some of the basic acronyms of criminal justice than they did 10 years ago, but they may not really understand what that means or why that matters. So I think that's kind of where it's really important to make sure people understand basic terminology. Avoid using statute codes if you can, but really make sure people understand why these terminology matter and try and use plain speak and make sure you're testing with people that aren't in your agency to make sure they would understand it too. Match the dashboard measures to the language of your organization. What that really means is if you have a strategic plan or you're actually using ways to kind of go out there and present this and really talk about the work of your organization, match it up to how your planning process works. Match it up to how you're talking about your 5-year plan for the county. Use those same goals, like really trying to align what these dashboards do to really the work of your larger organization, and don't have it be kind of a separate process that seems to live outside that. And lastly, make sure you're planning to kind of either both tell a story and how somebody's going to explore the data and kind of a narrative, but also the way the users are actually going to explore the data. And that gets to things like kind of user interface, is that if you're most people start from kind of the left and kind of go to the right. So make sure you're kind of like thinking about how the user will actually explore the data and not just put it out there with, so many things that the person actually is going to do things you don't want them to do, but see if you can actually design in a way that actually get them to do the things you want and explore the way that you would like to see that story told. And all this gets to kind of making sure that the dashboards are designed in a way that actually makes sense, is tested and actually has a plan for it, and isn't just kind of put out there as a, basically kind of on its own, but make sure it has context and you really understand who's going to be seeing it and what they might be doing to kind of go get it. I want to stop there and see if there's any questions or kind of like, is this kind of a process that makes sense to people? Have they tried this? I think this kind of gets to some of Karen's questions about audience. Would kind of going through a process like this be helpful on the front end? What are some people's thoughts about kind of those kind of work, doing this kind of work?
I can jump back in, Kevin. So I appreciate you laying out the process, and I feel like, yes, that's the way we want to approach it. I think in reality, at least for my county, is that we often jump to putting the visualization out there, and so then trying, just as you're mentioning, right? So we're having some challenges sort of going back to step one, but there's a lot of pressures on, just like you said, there's a lot of other pressures outside of our agency to sort of put this information out there. And so this process doesn't always come in this way. So just trying to incorporate those pieces very quickly when we're sort of starting at the last step and working back, I guess.
What's the one thing you wish people knew that they either misunderstand or wish you could articulate better if you were to, your top priority?
I think just what is the question they're trying to answer? I think you hit it right at the very beginning, which is they like the idea of a dashboard, they like the idea of transparent data, but when we ask that very specific question of, what are we trying to answer, or who is the audience, the answer we typically get back is we want it all. you know, we want, it's a gazillion different questions. And so trying to sort of refine that in a very tight timeline of, you know, it needs to be done in the next 2 weeks or something like that, where it's like, oh my goodness. So just the reality of, you know, organizations and how to sort of slow the process down has been, I think, my own personal challenge, but so that's it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to kind of talk more about that offline, about just how do you almost like create a roadmap for this. I think people also, if they aren't kind of hearing like what's going to come next, they get anxious and they say, I want it all, but really they want it to make sense too. But I think it also is the public audience versus you know, internal county interest questions, like those are almost like different situations. So if it's the public, you know, you have a one situation, but it's actually internal county stakeholders, that almost makes it harder, because then you're kind of really talking about inside baseball a little bit more too. And you're kind of like, so there's almost like different, and even internal to your agency within probation, I'm sure there's the same discussions, misunderstandings between different, you know, different parts of your group. So it's almost like it's almost like one big communication challenge, like what do you convey and how do you convey it? And then how do you get on a roadmap to make it all happen?
You know, I just want to go back and repeat what Mia said earlier too, is it is really helpful sometimes to have us help assist in those conversations. And so if you are working on dashboards or working on that structure, feel free to reach out and we can start connecting on those things. Because I think if you can set some expectations, or at least a plan of this is what we're planning to approach and this is how we're doing it, and you have kind of that side by side with CSAC, it might just be helpful in kind of helping pace it to where it's a realistic expectation. You can start putting things out in a realistic way that's meaningful, and not just a massive undertaking that gets overwhelming and is not really what you want to represent at the end of the day. So again, we're here for you as you move through these conversations.
And I think it's like, I mean, people want to hear what's next. So it's also kind of a, you know, a way to pace things a little bit. And I know, Karen, that sounds like you got a pace that's probably you're not controlling right now, to make it harder. But I think it's all these ways to kind of plan it and make it an ongoing project or program, not a one-time thing. Because that is the danger here, is you do it one time, people forget, and like, what's the next shiny thing, versus having a way to say, this is now a consistent source of information, and you're always going to get the same answer done the same way with the same approach year after year after year, versus a one-time thing that feels a little bit abstract or kind of, you know, almost like unvetted. But again, it's kind of that audience focus group type work that, you know, can actually pay off and give people a little more patience with the process. Before I jump, any other kind of comments or just kind of the process, or people kind of like pitfalls people have got, or kind of successes people have had with kind of actually building a dashboard kind of process from kind of start to finish, and actually launching it and getting it out there and having good results or positive results? Come back to that. Because I think the positive parts do come, and I think just from the tone of the case, the question so far have been like there's been a lot of challenges in getting dashboards off the ground. I think that's really a consistent problem in the field. Again, like the software's become prolific and you're getting it, you know, through all these ways, but actually going from start to finish, I think, is actually really hard. And I think there's some stats out there, I think, for just in the business world, government, whatever, it's a really high failure rate. Most projects don't make it. Like they don't get adopted, they don't get continued, they're gone in a year. And so really there's a challenge of not just creating it and launching it and getting it off the ground, but also sustaining it. So I think all these things kind of need to be put into consideration when you're kind of going this route, no matter what your form or your type of software choice is. So a couple kind of tips for effective kind of visualizations. I think, you know, just because you have put it in a dashboard doesn't mean you're still not making charts and graphs and trying to use color and visuals correctly, because there are some basic ideas that make a graph really good and that makes a graph or a chart really bad. And I think just kind of knowing what some of those differences are can just help with that. Usually I show like this ridiculous chart of like, was it banana prices in Ecuador, I want to say Brazil, and someplace else on a 3D graph with different columns. It's the most colorful, awful thing you've ever seen. But it's kind of my way to say, like, you could make a 3D chart with 3 dimensions and pictures of bananas on it, but people are going to get overwhelmed by it and not know what you're talking about. So just because you have the power doesn't mean you have to use it or should use it, and actually will distort from your message. So the idea is to make sure you're using stuff that is simple, that is clean. But I think one of our comments earlier was, just because you want to make it clean doesn't mean it's easy to make, because actually once you've kind of gotten to the point where there's nothing left to take away, that's really a great place to be. That's really hard to get there. That takes a lot of work to actually get down to a very simple visualization. And I think a lot of the best visualizations out there are the ones you go, wow, within a second, I knew exactly what they were saying. I was moved by it, and I know what to do about it. And those are really hard to do. And that's both a function of, you're kind of like asking the right question, having the right data, but then also really thinking really hard about what you're really trying to say with that graph and what that takeaway is. And so that's all stuff that's doable, but it really does take planning, and this isn't something that kind of comes out of thin air. It does take a lot of work and a lot of kind of thought and process and iteration. And so I like to remember that actually a lot of what you see and hear is perceived through visual. So no matter what you're hearing, saying, smelling, feeling, your eye is going to tell you so much information about what you actually take away from something, no matter what the words say. And so that's really an important part of this, is that all this new software possibilities, but you still think about accessibility and just our nature of, we see a chart, we see a graph, we take away information right away. So it's really important to think about that visual is what is really going to be the thing that people take away from it. The words are less so, they just kind of come later. A big, I think, question, and part of it too, is like, should you use a table or a chart? I think this is important because there is some value in tables, because it's usually it's kind of more individual values. You actually want to know over time what things say or across different categories, because there's value in actually knowing those exact numbers, not just the trend or the chart. And really you want to see what you actually want some kind of precision involved and some kind of detail. And also you can have multiple values and measures in one place. But the idea is you just want kind of a summary table. Like that's a really important part. You want to use those kind of with care, with intention, versus a chart where actually the message is kind of in that pattern of the trends. And I think the difference there is you want to make sure you're using one or the other, and you kind of know why you're using the one or the other, because obviously a table can be made into a chart, and it's not that, that's kind of the issue here. But really, is it what's the best way to convey the information you want to have, and what's going to give the person the level of specificity or precision they're looking for versus the bigger picture. And I think these are oftentimes kind of confused a little bit. And the other kind of addendum here would be, if you're going to use a table, only use as many decimals as you actually need. Going out to 4 decimal places is not probably ever necessary unless you're talking about, maybe like really specific percentages, interest rates, because you want that extra nickel a month interest, whatever it is. You want to make sure you're actually doing that level of precision that matters, and visually is going to be helpful to someone seeing the story. Because most people can't look at a table of data and really get it without kind of seeing some of those trends, but some people really do want that level of precision. So kind of choosing between a chart or a table is kind of an important first consideration. And then some of my most favorite kind of games here, and we can either do this through chat or just kind of yell it out, but what's wrong with this chart? I mean, tell me why this chart is going to be, what do you see wrong with this? And what information do you get from this chart just by looking at it? Drop it in the chat or come off mute, either way. I'll kind of reveal in about 10 seconds. I'll have Ryan do this since this is his favorite.
I was telling Kevin, this is what you do when you want to show success that doesn't exist, right? 4.9% to 5.2% looks like pretty big bars for small jumps in whatever you're measuring.
So the difference here between 90214 and zip code 92222 is about 2 percentage points, so 0.2%. And it's also a success rate for what? So I would say this actually has 2 things going wrong. The scale is cut at 4.9, so it gives you this impression that, wow, this other zip code is really doing great, or it has a much higher success rate just visually without even reading the axes, because you don't expect somebody to cut it right there. But also, like, what's kind of a weirdly labeled chart. You need more context to know what this is a success rate of. So context matters as well. But this is also getting to, do you want to see extra values in it? Would you want to see more? But point being, this is a common issue, and it's like making sure you're kind of using those axes correctly, not to cut things off and distort the actual message of your chart. This is one of I see this a lot. So this is actually a chart of all the bookings into a jail by the offense reason. So these are all those reasons why someone gets into jail at the statute level. Annoying child is not my children. It's a crime. But the idea is actually there's probably 70 or 80 different kind of categories here, subcategories. And these are all put into a pie chart. So what's wrong with that? Or how would you make this better? Busy. Yes, Karen got it. The big issue I have is that more than 5 categories, nobody can actually see that or actually discern a difference. So obviously you can look at this one and go, wow, this is a DUI. I just kind of know the data and it's similar color, but at some point here, these are 7 different shades of fuchsia, pink. They're getting pretty deep in the color wheel here. And at some point, you really can't tell the difference between these different levels. So the point here is that more than 5 categories really makes it hard for people to see, especially in these kind of pie chart graphics. So at some point, you can't really keep loading up the categories anymore. You have to kind of start simplifying. And that's where having an idea of what you're trying to display and what's the most important really be helpful, because at some point, if one of these happens, these pie slivers is 0.001%, is that really the most important thing to show, unless it's something that happens very rarely but is really important? Call it out a different way. And combine similar offenses is actually the solution here from Tricia. So actually, you would say, what are the 5 or 6 main, maybe DOJ, I think 5 different kind of main DOJ areas, combine them together. If you want to highlight one that you think is really important, like maybe some of the violent crimes, you can do that. But make sure you're kind of making this chart as simple as possible so one takes away the right message and doesn't have to kind of like think too hard about what all these different ones mean, unless it's really a common theme. So similar approach here. This is a booking trend, same awesome color wheel across a couple different years. So how could you make this chart better? And is this the right, what other kind of chart choice might you use? Bar chart from Natasha. Yeah, I would agree with that. Make the comparisons useful and perceptible, because let's say that this is, back to we can see this DUI chunk here in fuchsia. That's the biggest one, but maybe it goes from 25% to 24%. And, we really can't see any difference here because our eyes can't actually perceive how big these different slices are across these different areas, because our eye is moving from left to right. So break it down by different areas, more detail maybe by months. So maybe more detail into these different time periods. But the point is, when you're doing these different visual mediums, make sure someone can actually see the differences you're trying to show, or else it just becomes one big glob. But if you actually look a little closer here, the blue one, which I'm forgetting what it is, actually is down quite a bit. But that's kind of the last thing you end up seeing, because there's so many other colors going on here, and it's hard for the eye to track across these things. So the point is, make sure the comparisons are useful. And you also can see them if you're doing them. Last one of these, I had more, but I tried to cut them. But yeah.
Oh, sorry, I don't want to slow you down if you're rushed.
Oh, sorry,
I just wanted to mention, there's a stage at which you have an analyst working with the data to summary files that will underlie the dashboard. And that person has pretty specialized skills relative to the broad audience for the dashboard. And one of the things that's important to do at that stage is to figure out what you're seeing in the data that's really important to highlight, right? And sometimes we jump right to just a set of all the different ways we could look at the data. But at that exploratory stage, it's really important to think, like, what are we seeing that, and this is a good example because you have all these offense types, but maybe there are a couple of them that are really shifting over time. So maybe that's what you're trying to make sure to convey, like in this pie chart. And so zeroing in on that and making it a line graph with months or something like that. So there's a stage at which you have to, I think of like working with data as trying to understand what the data wants to tell us. And then once you understand what the data wants to tell us, that's important, then figuring out how to create visualizations to help a broader audience to understand that.
And I think the challenge there too is that analyst, or the person that's as deep in the data as they could be and really understand the data itself, they've got to find a way to convey that information with that data as well. So it's almost like you're kind of like doing it with one hand behind your back. You're trying to make this really a compelling visualization, hope that somebody really gets all the richness you see in it, but you can't show them all the richness you've learned. You have to kind of show it in a very basic visualization. So actually, the way that dashboards are kind of helpful is actually they free kind of an analytic person having to have 10 different charts. You actually just have one visual, but then the user can cut it different ways to get to that information. But the idea is that you have somebody who really understands the data itself, not just pumping out volumes of dashboards. I think that's kind of the trap we get into, is that we want dashboard plural, but we don't know really why. We actually don't know what it says, because it's like a different person. So it's kind of making sure that the visuals match the intention and also have some form of exploration that goes on with that. ADA, that's a great one. ADA issues are actually, it comes up quite a bit. And actually, I think when you actually think about it, things like colors and color blindness, as well as kind of fonts and things that actually would show up on different kinds of screens, Luckily, some of the newer software is actually, I think, kind of helps you not to be out of compliance with ADA. So actually, I think there's some limits in how it actually shows certain colors, but there are things like color blindness that actually would limit your audience. But I think it's also kind of making sure using colors that are, fairly responsive and actually would have high enough contrast to actually do that. And I think that's kind of why color, being that it probably couldn't get any more colorful charts in the world than these three right here. They're both like making sure these are actually, anybody can actually see these based on the contrast issues as well as being ADA compliant. So you're putting it on your public website, it does have to have some kind of level of ADA compliance, or else that will, kind of throw up red flags. Boo, thank you for that. I know that Tableau and Power BI are both ADA compliant in the way that they actually display things and what they kind of are certified for, but it's still up to you when you're actually looking at some of the color choices and some of the design choices that make sure they would, that people could reach this in a broadest possible audience. Last chart before we move on, or we kind of go to some examples. What's wrong with this one? This is a chart of two different charts. One's of jail bookings by severity. The other one is bookings by gender. Color swatch at Home Depot, yes. This is Bear Paint number 1426. Also the color of my living room, or it would be if I was to get this color. Sure. So I think the big issue I see with this one is that one, the labels are wrong. So I think two people pointed out that misdemeanor, felony, also male, female. Okay, make sure you're actually using the right, making sure you're explaining these different letters and what they mean. But also using the same color of blue in both ones kind of implies they're kind of the same, or there's some kind of coordination there. So people actually want to see coordination. They want to see similarities. That's the eye is always drawn to the same. And so the issue here is really to make sure you're using colors that actually show the same thing if they are the same thing. So you actually could do the same chart, but make sure misdemeanor, felony actually means what you intend. Or also get kind of confused by the same color, the same use, but totally different meaning. And I think that's really, when you get to kind of more complicated dashboards with multiple visualizations, there's kind of this want to show lots of colors and differentiate the geography from the gender, from all these different things, but really kind of keep the color tone simple. I think it helps people, or else it does kind of feel visually overwhelming and probably does cause some level of anxiety when you just have too many colors and too many different kind of things telling you different things, because the eye is absorbing all this information. The brain can't always kind of figure out what it's actually trying to say without some help. So making sure the colors make sense and they're used with care is kind of the last kind of tip there. And I think we had one here, I think we had a little handout we're going to give, but I think this is kind of like, chart making 101, but we're really trying to kind of look at like, what's the most effective way to show your information, composition. So back to those pie charts. Pie charts are a fine way to show composition, but really you're trying to say, we have a couple different categories. What percent of the whole do they make up? And the same thing with things like stacked columns or bar charts. What's the composition of it? How many are of one part? And then you kind of stack them together to say, of a certain time period or a category, what does that composition look like? You're trying to compare things. Use a column or a bar chart. You're actually trying to say, we have in this quarter we have this, in this quarter we have slightly less. You can see a comparison. And then also line charts can also then show you those trends over time or across categories. And then distributions and relationships are things like a scatter plot, where maybe on the x-axis and the y, on the x-axis you have one set of categories, and the y-axis you have another one. You want to see, when you actually plot those out, what kind of relationship you see across those. So as age goes up, maybe like net worth is supposed to go up for certain categories of people. Why is it you see differences there? You can actually see on one axis, on the other axis, and you plot those out and see what those differences are. And also things like line charts can also show those distributions. But the point is to kind of choose the chart that's going to best show your information and not distort it. And that's kind of back to like my pie chart example that I went through, to make sure you're using these things to do the best to your data and not confuse it, and also make sure people can see what you intend them to see. Got a couple things in chat. Any other questions before we move on? Mia, Ryan, or Mike? Anybody have any horror stories of bad charts they've seen, or charts the best chart they've ever done, or kind of anything that are kind of hit you after people beyond these, besides not using bananas in a pie chart or a bar chart? All right. So I'm gonna do a couple of case studies here, and then actually I'm glad Karen Baker is here because I was gonna do a little profile of actually the one that Alameda County put out in their public dashboard. And I think it's really, what I really like about it is partly it really kind of went through a process. And I think really kind of helps to be kind of, and it's actually a publicly available site. So I'll put up, yay, Alameda County. It's on their public site, and I'll put that in the chat in a second. What I really like about this process, so it really kind of did try and think about what do people want to know and how do we make sure they get that and what's the best way to kind of show that in a way that's accessible and let people kind of explore themselves. And I'll let Karen kind of add a little more in a second here, but let me pull it up and I will, I'll show you. All right. So this is actually on their public website. I'm trying to get to the URL here. I'm going to put this in the chat. And the idea here is actually when Alameda County went and did this, they actually pulled together a couple different ideas. And I am, oops, sorry, I meant to do the other one. Stop share. I'm going to drop this in the chat so you guys can see it, and then I'm going to show a slide. Too many screens. And so the idea here is really kind of what do they want to do? And it's kind of back to like, what are the goals in creating these displays? And so when we kind of started working with them on this, really kind of they had a goal in mind. And I think part of it was really to create a visual display that really helped to, you know, just kind of show who probation serves. So I think in the kind of in the feeling that probation had is that they had the challenge that people were always asking who's on probation, what are they there for, all these kind of complicated questions. And oftentimes, if you ask different people at different days, you get slightly different answers, not totally different, but really there wasn't the consistency you might want to get from actually somebody asking kind of a basic population question. And so really kind of started with what's the question you really want people to know. And the value here was actually you could also reduce staff workload, remember to answer the question lots of different ways and ask, you know, run the query and things like that. But also then reduce the amount of disparity or difference in what people might say. So like say Kevin would include, you know, people that are on informal probation, but maybe somebody else wouldn't include people on informal probation. Point is people are giving slightly different answers to a similar question. How do you kind of get kind of the one set of information, make sure that data is pulled the same way consistently? So really and use that as a visual display. Use a point in time to show the basic kind of view across various factors. And the reason the point in time was chosen was because that's the easiest way to kind of say at the end of the month, let's say on March 31st, who's on probation and what are they there for? It's the simplest way to do it. Doesn't take a lot of querying. It's a fairly basic kind of thing to kind of think about. And also it's pretty easy to understand once you kind of see and look at the data. It says, as of a given day, here's who these people are. Fairly straightforward. It also allows you to query down to things like demographic features, and be it race, ethnicity, age, gender, and also board districts as well, which I thought was a really interesting innovation to think about, is that if people want to think about this and who's actually looking at this, there's this insight that actually their board members and their board staff really wanted to know, well, how many people are on probation in my district? What does this look like for my, you know, people to vote for me? And so it's kind of this kind of idea that if you can kind of make sure there's enough kind of controls on it, people can cut it and look at it in ways that really do, you know, give them the answers they want to see. And so this is like the static version of this, and I'll go to the live version in a second. And so what I like about this is it shows, you know, multiple different types of information, showed a couple different ways. And the idea here is you actually can both see, you know, the basic information of on a given quarter, you know, how many people are on supervision as of the last day of the month. You can also look at it by city, the last known city of residence. A basic trend over time that just says, you know, over time, here's how many people have been on this as they've kind of taken the data at different points in time. Here's that trend over time on the top right. And then also whereas to kind of look at different age trends as well as gender, as well as race and ethnicity. And then lastly, the supervisorial district. So in one kind of view, you get a lot of different kinds of information. And then on top of that, it's also interactive. So let me show that real quick. I put the site in there. And so what I like about this website is actually it's, you know, on their public facing website, so you can get through it right through a URL. What you can then do is say, I want to know more about the people on probation in different parts of the county, and I'm really interested in post-release community supervision. What this then shows is over time, here's what that population looked like. So you have about 350 people in Oakland on down the list. Gives you more information about their actual the demography of them. So they skew a little bit younger, about 25 to 44 is most of the people in this group. mostly male, about 60%, on and on. So also you end up seeing though is also you have this then listing of how many PRCS clients are in each supervisorial district. So the point here is you actually can query it and go between categories, and it's not just a static dashboard, but you actually can drill into it and look at different themes as you're interested. And I think, if you're looking at just, female, you can also then query it for that. But the idea is that also you can't go much deeper than this, and that's for a reason, is that much past this, you also start risking what's called re-identification. And so if you are able to get down to a very specific level of a city, a gender, an age, a race, and a status on supervision, you might actually risk somebody actually being re-identified or kind of basically called re-identified. And the idea there is you're actually, even though you haven't told anybody their name, to get down to a certain number of people, usually below 10 people in a certain area, that means you're actually risking them being what's called re-identified. And the idea here is you're going to put this out to the public. You want to make sure that you're not doing that, especially when things that are very specific or might have what's called small cell sizes. So that's the adult version. And I won't go through the juvenile one, but they also have one for juvenile as well. If you go to right here. So for juvenile field services, they have the same one or kind of a similar view, and then also a similar view for their camps and facilities. So the idea here is you can actually look at things in a couple different ways. It's kind of got a lot of the main population that probation serves in one place. It's on a public website. And you can also get to the underlying data, which is kind of, I think, what Boo was mentioning about like a open data site. You can actually get at Alameda County's open data website and actually download the underlying data and do your own analysis. And then also it shows a population summary. And so this is, I think, the part that actually gets at what does that profile look like. And so every quarter, they actually kind of say, what's the purpose of the dashboard, do a quick overview of what's in the data, basically exactly from what's on the dashboard. So actually you're using the same terminology, explaining the views you're seeing, and also highlighting kind of why it's being done. And so the idea behind this, and I think is kind of the consistency here, is how do you convey the complexities of what probation is trying to do or what the justice system is trying to do for an audience that may only know bits and pieces of the work you actually are participating in. So the idea here is to use some kind of a handout or some kind of a fact sheet to really kind of highlight what the work being done, what some of the terminology is, and also what that kind of relates to. And so the idea is this goes with the dashboard. And so every time this is published, they also have an updated data sheet. And so it's easy. It's a nice, easy takeaway. It then gives you a little more kind of narrative about what's being done and who's being served. And so what I like about this package is that, one, it kind of frees the data visually. So if you're not a spreadsheet person, you can actually look and interact and get information. It actually frees the data so you actually can download it and work with it if you're of that interest. And also then it actually gives a quick narrative for somebody who just wants to know the basic facts of a given point in time. And so I think those three things make this a pretty successful kind of implementation. And I think what's also been impressive about it too is also I think they've also then integrated this into their request for information process. So they can actually divert, in a way, more people to this dashboard site if people are coming with like requests for information that could be met through this public dashboard, or it goes through a different process. But the idea is you're being transparent, you're offering data to people, but also you're then making sure that the process that takes more kind of assistance and actually interaction is done for only the cases that would really need it. So I think what that kind of tells me is that actually is a pretty good case to make for just basic public information. And I think also that helps the organization kind of know kind of what they're doing and how they're doing it. But I want to stop there and see if Karen or other folks in Alameda kind of had comments or, how has it really gone? So, it looks nice. And I think, being a part of it, I think was a really great output of it. But I want to make sure has it had the value you've all thought it had? And then what other questions has it kind of brought up for you all to do more of?
Oh, thanks, Kevin. Actually, the first thing I'm thinking is, hey, where's Q4? And it started 2021, so I'll be cracking the whip on a couple folk. But yeah, Chief Still and I came from Department of Corrections, and so we're used to a data set like this being published on the regular. And I think Chief Still was very impressed with when CPOC redesigned their website, and so those things inspired her. I think we leaned heavily on your expertise to get it going. But we assembled a work group of our data experts across the department. And like I said, they came up with the data dictionary of what's going to make it up each time. We've hit a couple of snags along the way, mainly because we did transition over to a new case management system. On the juvenile side, they had Prism, and now we have Tyler. And on the adult side, we didn't have an automated case management system. And so those are the overall challenges I think we've faced. But now that everything is in place, it just needs to be refreshed regularly. So I apologize that it's not showing more current data, but I think it has helped. As you said, I remind people who request things through the Public Record Act request process of our data website, and it gets a lot of use. And I don't know about other counties, but in this county, the supervisors are definitely interested in seeing lots of our demographics by district. So this has saved a lot of staff work, and it also ensures consistency, because before we went through this process, requests would come into individuals and to their individual emails, and there wasn't a lot of quality control going on. And this helps us to ensure that as well.
Any kind of like downsides or things that you kind of would advise other people as they're starting this out, or things that besides the case management changes, but like other things, any kind of negative things that have happened, or kind of like, public, like journalistic stories or things you would say is like, a warning sign or a communications issue?
No, I haven't seen any downsides to it at all. And I think our public
Great.
appreciates being able to access it. The types of Public Record Act requests I get now is, well, how many DPOs are assigned in my city? So,
Right.
It's the same old story. If you don't give them anything, then they demand something, and you give them something, then they want more. But it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think when we actually looked at the requests that you were getting over the course of the year or so, we kind of found out that almost like 75 or 80% were all related to something like who's on probation, where are they, those kind of things. So, I hope it saved people time. And I think it's back to like quality and consistency. But it's like also kind of knowing the kind of questions that people have on the front end also helps to know what's going to get you the most, kind of like alleviate the most questions and avoid, the fire drill type work.
Definitely.
One other part I think that we're talking with your contract unit about too is actually putting this into RFPs. So actually when people go out to bid or use RFPs, they actually can go to the site and kind of know who they're serving and where, what the basic demography is, and just, it's kind of back to one set of facts and not have the CBOs have to kind of guess or kind of think about it. They can actually say, okay, I kind of know how many people are here in these different places, versus kind of the approach, which is they kind of have to guess at it. So a lot of kind of benefit there for.
Thank you for saying that. That's a really good example of where having this, we do a number of RFPs, and sometimes we are looking for services across the various districts in the county. And in the past, that was a really heavy lift for staff. And for the longest time, we were relying on data from a database that had crashed and so nobody could access it again. I mean, it literally died. And so I think it helps inform our RFPs. It helps inform gaps and needs of services. It helps inform a lot of things for us. So thank you for mentioning that.
Okay. All right. We've got about 7 minutes left. I was going to do one more kind of a jail booking slide, but I think we're kind of low on time. So I want to kind of skip to the end here. So I'll just show a visual of it and kind of talk about the design attributes where, sure. And so the idea here behind this one was, the county wanted to kind of know who are the people coming into contact with the jail who have mental health concerns. And the idea is they just wanted to kind of get a better idea of who's coming through their jail system, what are they, like, kind of what's the general profile, what are they there for, and also then to kind of be able to kind of slice and dice it by, one, what is their kind of their booking sequence, how many times have they actually been in custody over the last couple of years, as well as some of the different kind of ways that the different crimes will come in for if they are, screening positive for things like mental health concerns. And so what this dashboard kind of allows you to do is then kind of look a little deeper and say, I'm really interested in the people in whatever this zip code is, click on it, and then you can actually query it by kind of geography, and then you're kind of down to a more specific look. And then also be able to kind of go, we also want to know more about what some of the mental health concerns are. With the idea being you want to be able to, drill down a little further and get more information about who these folks are on a compositional note, which is different than really understanding who's there, or kind of back to kind of the static population. It's really kind of who's flowing through. So the important thing about anything about this could be done for juvenile halls, for anything that's kind of like a flow through. So you're kind of talking about the front door and who's coming in. It's not necessarily who stays or how long they stay or kind of what's happening while they're there, but it's at least understanding kind of that front part of what's happening. And the idea here behind this, at least this visual, is you can actually look at this across entries. You can actually query it by these different kind of booking types, and then also across demography and things like that. But again, more kind of for exploration, and the purpose being more of an internal kind of county level dashboard for a mental health working group that actually wanted to look at this and understand who are these folks coming through, what else could we do? If we want to build out a diversionary program, what are we really talking about? What are they actually getting in for? But the idea here is back to kind of exploration and not necessarily knowing how someone might explore or what they might learn. But the more you can be somewhat kind of transparent about it, the better your partners can help you. But the use case for this was, an internal county working group. This wasn't a public dashboard, but the idea being you could do something similar. But again, that takes, partnership from the people that own the data. And that gets to kind of the partnerships you have to really start merging data across entities, which is different than your own agency data. But the idea here is I think there's lots of ways to kind of go about visualizing data. I think there's the proliferation of kind of views. And really it's kind of back to what are the kind of questions you want to answer? What are the things people that are going to be looking at it the most really care about? And then can they get there with the level of detail you have access to the data for? I want to stop there and then maybe throw it back to Ryan for kind of the last Q&A and kind of that'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so as we move into the next couple of weeks, we have, actually the next 2 months, we have the final pieces of our seminar series for programming and the data and evaluation pieces. But before we jump into what those are going to be covering, I just want to see if there's any questions out there about what we've discussed today or any comments, any input. This is re-motivating, and it's pretty incredible that we've come this far. So yeah, just exciting work out there, and seeing the county work is truly just inspiring. So great job, Alameda, Santa Clara, everybody that really is putting time and energy into this. It's so important. So I'm going to stop. I don't see any raised hands. You can also unmute and just offer up anything right now. Otherwise, we will move on. Okay, let's go to the last couple of slides. So as always, on the website that we had at the initial link, there are materials available. You can see a data dashboard process overview and key questions. Those are two basically one-page documents to help starting you down that pathway of thinking through what kind of questions to ask and what kind of process can you ultimately approach in terms of how to create data dashboards. And then there's a more detailed guide to dashboard design. It's a little older in terms of when it was developed, but it really does create a really thoughtful approach and gives a lot of good information about how dashboards can ultimately be designed and created. So that's all available on our website and the seminar series. As we move into June, we have our last programming seminar, which is coming up. And that is going to be, go ahead and go to the next slide for me, Kev. That's going to be covering the final piece of the cost benefit analysis, really focusing on what we've learned over the course of doing 10 with counties, and really kind of describing how that's being used, what can be used with it, and ultimately what can you do with the cost benefit analysis. Most of the ones done to date are based on national information, and how can you ultimately use that to make fiscal decisions? How have counties used that? And hopefully we'll have some county stories as well about how they've been able to do that, especially as we move into fiscal situations where oftentimes we're trying to balance the fiscal constraints that are out there, or additional funding that might be coming down the pike. So it really can be used in a multitude of ways. And then in July, we'll have our last seminar on the data and programming series, focused on, next slide, please, just so we can get the summary out there. Focused on really looking at how do you use data in different ways, particularly focusing on data to monitor outcomes versus conducting an evaluation. And Mia and team will go through kind of the differences that you see there, and really discussing the key steps and ultimately what it will take to conduct evaluations and how those findings can be used to really inform future programming decisions. So those are our final two. It has been a long haul, and we're so appreciative of everyone being here. You can always visit our website, and we are always available, even if it's just for a review of a dashboard or to ultimately start on something more broadly. We're absolutely here to help. That is the whole purpose of the Support Hub. In any way that you can think of, we are a partner in that. And so I'll let everyone get back to their day, barring no questions. Kevin, Mia, Mike, anything to add on the end of this? Hearing and seeing none. Oh, Kevin.
My only quote would be, just because you can doesn't mean you should. My one takeaway from dashboard from 15 years of doing this, like just because you have the ability, the color, the theme, the technical know-how, less is always more. Start with simple and go from there. That'd be my takeaway.
I think that's a beautiful way to end it. Thanks, Kevin. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next month. And as always, we are always available to answer any questions along the way. Thank you.